China has admitted the balloon spotted over Latin America on Friday belonged to them, but denied it was being used for surveillance. US fighter jets downed another balloon which entered the airspace above the Carolinas on Saturday. Joining us live is Prof Rothwell, Professor of International Law at ANU. Don, always good to see you. Thanks for your time. From an international law perspective, does China appear to be guilty of any violations here?
I think it's fairly clear that, yes, China has acknowledged that the two balloons, the one over Latin America and the United States, were Chinese balloons. These balloons were drifting over both continents without any prior permission or authorization from the relevant countries. And in fact, China admitted that the US balloon was there as a result of force majeure, in other words, suggesting some sort of distress. So the United States, in terms of responding to the balloon over continental US, was well within its rights to eventually take the action to shoot that balloon down over the Carolinas on Sunday, Australian time.
And would it be safe to assume, Don, that Australia would carry out a similar downing of a balloon if it happened over our airspace?
Look, that's a really interesting question, and it's one that I've been pondering about in recent days. Obviously, Australia would now say, well, at least we've got some US precedent in that regard. I guess some consideration would need to be given as to where the balloon was actually located. If it was drifting east to west across the Australian continent, similar to the flight path of the balloon over the United States, I think Australia would probably be forced to take that course of action. On the other hand, if it was drifting over an Australian island, for example, Christmas Island, or over parts of the Australian coast, a different type of approach would need to be taken. So there'd be a range of factors that would need to be taken into account. But I think one significant difference would be is that we know that the United States was reluctant to down the balloon because of the potential loss of life in terms of the balloon coming down over urban areas. Obviously, that wouldn't be as much of an issue in terms of bringing down a balloon over Central Australia, which we know is very lightly populated.
Well, China, of course, is saying that the balloon just malfunctioned and essentially drifted off course. Not many experts seem to be buying that explanation. What does it tell us about China's military assertiveness then, when you do put it in the context of what's happening in the South China Sea, for example?
Well, first of all, China is not denying that it was its balloon and that China was using these balloons. Of course, they've contended that it was for the purposes of investigating weather, but I think all of the evidence would suggest that it's engaged in intelligence gathering. Many experts over the last 48 hours have pointed to the fact that both China and the United States engage in these types of activities, so it wouldn't necessarily be exceptional that the United States would also be seeking to engage in the use of balloons for intelligence gathering. It's just that perhaps the Chinese have been caught out in this instance. But what's really quite exceptional is that this balloon has been flying over continental USA. And as we know, people were able to record the trajectory of this balloon with their iPhones, which is really quite exceptional, as I said. The United States does engage in spy flights over parts of the South China Sea. Of course, the United States says that that's over territory and maritime areas that the United States doesn't recognize as China. So the more interesting question is how close to those US surveillance missions, whether they're with satellites, with aircraft, or even with balloons, actually go over the Chinese mainland. And that's something I can't answer.
Don, I think in this technological age, a lot of us were surprised to see a balloon being used by the Chinese, but balloons actually do have a pretty significant place in military history when you look back at it.
Oh, definitely. And of course, they were originally used for surveillance purposes during the Napoleonic Wars over 200 years ago. They were originally also used for bombing campaigns, but their more contemporary usage from a surveillance and from a spying perspective is that they allow for much lower elevation. The type of balloon that we're considering here can operate at around 60,000 feet, and that gives the ability to gain intelligence and collect data, which is perhaps more accurate and more effective than that intelligence and data that might be secured from even low orbiting satellites, for example. And also balloons can hover over a location for a much longer period of time, whereas satellites are constantly spinning consistent with the Earth's trajectory. So balloons do offer some level of advantage in terms of surveillance and intelligence gathering, which obviously militarily is quite important.
So, John, out of interest, just how far up in the sky does international law actually extend to? How high is okay for flyovers? I mean, satellites obviously roam over all our nations all the time.
Yeah, look, that's a great question. And this is one of the ambiguities of international law. International law certainly covers the traditional height directories of military and civilian aircraft, which is around between 30 to 35,000 feet. The Concorde, which we now know is no longer in operation, traditionally operated at 60,000 feet. That was a supersonic aircraft. And this balloon floating over the United States was also at around 60,000 feet. So there's no issue there in terms of US law being able to say, well, this is within our flight path, this is within our airspace, and we can exercise control over that. Satellites, on the other hand, operate at high trajectories, and they fall not within the realm of national law, but really within the realm of space law. And there's a whole different body of law regulating that, for which there is no permission that needs to be gained for those satellites to hover over Australia and pass over Australia as they do on a very regular basis, for example.
That is a conversation we can have another time. Professor Don Rothwell, always appreciate your insights and analysis. Thank you.
You're welcome.